The silence was the first sign. It was a structural flaw in the architecture of his evening, a load-bearing wall of noise that had suddenly been removed, leaving the entire framework of his reality groaning under a stress it was not designed to bear. Liam stood in the doorway of the house he had framed with his own hands, the scent of sawdust and fresh paint still a ghost in the drywall. The air was cold, still, and unnaturally quiet. Lily's toys were scattered across the living room floor like the brightly coloured debris of a shipwreck, but the usual symphony of her laughter and Sarah's humming was gone. It was a vacuum, a void where the sounds of his life should have been. If stories about resilience, the price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage speak to you, stay with me. He walked through the house, his work boots heavy on the hardwood floors he had laid, and finished himself. Each plank had been a promise, each nail a vow. Now they felt like the hollow deck of an empty ship. In the kitchen, a single piece of paper sat on the granite countertop, held down not by a magnet or a coffee cup, but by the weight of her wedding ring. The diamond, a stone he had worked a year of overtime to afford, glinted under the recessed lighting with a cold, indifferent fire. It was a cruel precision, a deliberate placement meant to inflict maximum damage. It was not an oversight, it was a statement. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine white lines of 1,000 minor cuts and scrapes from his work as a carpenter, felt clumsy as he picked up the note. The paper was crisp, expensive stationery, not the grocery list notepads they usually used. Her handwriting, a fluid and elegant script he had once loved, now looked alien, sharp. It was short, a masterpiece of efficient cruelty. "I can't do this anymore, Liam. I need more than this. Julian can give me the life I deserve. Lily is with my mother for the night. You're the stable one. You'll be a better father without me holding you back. Don't try to find me." The words were not an apology. They were a verdict. He was judged and found wanting. His life, his work, the calluses on his hands. All of it was this, a thing to be escaped. He read it again and then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into a different meaning. But they remained fixed, an epitaph for his marriage carved into a cheap piece of paper. He looked around the kitchen at the custom cabinets he had built, the backsplash he had meticulously tiled. He saw her ghost everywhere, laughing by the stove, leaning against the counter, her perfume a phantom scent mingling with the lemon dish soap. Now the space was just a collection of wood, stone, and metal. The soul had been ripped out of it. He checked their bedroom. Her side of the closet was a gaping void. Her drawers were empty. The top of her dresser, usually a curated clutter of perfumes, jewelry, and creams, was wiped clean. She had been methodical. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was an excavation. She had hollowed out their life, taking what she valued and leaving the rest behind like rubble. The secondary burden, the one that settled on his shoulders with the physical weight of concrete, was Lily. The note said she was with her grandmother, but that was a temporary reprieve, a stay of execution. Sarah hadn't just left him, she had abandoned their 5-year-old daughter. She had looked at the beautiful, messy, wonderful chaos of their child and decided she was an anchor, a weight holding her back from the life she deserved. A cold fury, colder and harder than any grief, began to set in Liam's gut. It was the slow, chilling process of steel quenching in oil. He was no longer just a betrayed husband. He was a fortress with one last precious person to protect. He sank onto the edge of the bed they had shared, the mattress dipping under his weight, and the silence of the house pressed in, vast and absolute. The work of demolition was complete. The work of rebuilding, he knew, was just beginning, and he had no blueprint. The first few weeks were a blur of numb autopilot. Time became a thick, viscous fluid he had to force himself through each day. Mornings were the worst, waking to the cold space beside him in the bed, the indentation of her head on the pillow long gone, the scent of her shampoo faded from the linens. He moved like a machine, his actions dictated by the necessities of another small human being. Get Lily up, make breakfast, cereal, always cereal, because anything more complex felt like an insurmountable feat of engineering. Pack her lunch, drive her to his mother-in-law's, a drive filled with a tense, brittle silence, because what could either of them possibly say? Then, work. The construction site was both a punishment and a salvation. It was a place of loud, violent noise that drowned out the roaring silence in his head. The physical exertion was a balm, a way to channel the furious, helpless energy coiling in his muscles. He threw himself into the labor, hoisting drywall, framing walls, his body aching and screaming for rest. But the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the gaping wound in his life. His boss, Marcus Thorne, a man built like a cinder block with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, watched him with shrewd, unsympathetic eyes. Marcus cared about two things, the deadline and the budget. Liam's personal apocalypse was not on the punch list. Once, Liam's hand slipped while using a circular saw, the blade screaming as it bit into the plywood millimeters from his fingers. Marcus was on him in an instant, not with concern, but with a low growl. "You got your head on straight, Miller? This side ain't a place for daydreaming. A mistake like that costs me money. A mistake a few inches to the left costs you a hand." Liam just nodded, his throat tight, and went back to work. The near miss a jolt of adrenaline that barely registered through the fog of his misery. The world had shrunk to the next task, the next nail, the next 2x4. The house, once his pride, became a hostile zone. Dishes piled up in the sink, monuments to his exhaustion. Laundry became an unconquered mountain range in the basement. He and Lily ate takeout on the floor of the living room because the dining room table felt too large, too empty. He was failing, a slow-motion collapse under the crushing weight of single parenthood and a full-time, physically demanding job. He was operating on fumes, a machine running without oil, grinding its gears down to dust. The anxiety was a constant hum beneath the surface, the fear that he would break, that he would fail Lily, that Sarah had been right, that he wasn't enough. He saw the confusion in his daughter's eyes when she asked when Mommy was coming home, and each time the question came, a piece of him fractured. He would offer a vague, useless answer, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth, because the truth was a weapon too terrible to use on a child. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It had been a brutal day at the site, a concrete pour that went late under a relentless, punishing sun. He was covered in sweat and grime, his muscles trembling with fatigue. He was already 30 minutes late to pick up Lily. He raced across town, the guilt a hot poker in his chest, and found her sitting on the steps of the daycare, the last child there, her face small and worried. The look of relief that washed over her when she saw his truck was immediately replaced by a fresh wave of his own self-loathing. He had made her feel abandoned, even for a moment. He was failing. That night he tried to make a real meal, something other than pizza or macaroni and cheese. He was trying to be better, to be the stable one. He was cooking spaghetti, Lily humming and coloring at the kitchen table, a small island of normalcy in their chaotic world. He reached into the refrigerator for the milk, his hand clumsy with exhaustion. The carton slipped. For a split second it seemed to hang in the air, a perfect white rectangle against the faded linoleum. Then it hit the floor, exploding in a tidal wave of white. It was not a catastrophe. It was just spilled milk. But in that moment, it was everything. It was every mistake he had ever made, every promise he had broken, every way in which he was not enough. It was the saw slipping, the late pickup, the empty side of the bed, the cold ring on the counter. It was the final straw on a structure already loaded past its breaking point, the strength that had held him together, the sheer, stubborn will to keep moving, simply disintegrated. He didn't shout, he didn't curse. A sound, a raw, ragged thing torn from the deepest part of his chest, escaped his lips. He slid down the kitchen cabinets and landed on the floor with a soft thud, right in the middle of the spreading white puddle. The cold of the milk soaked through his jeans, a final, miserable indignity. He put his head in his hands and the world went dark. He had hit rock bottom, and it was a cold, sticky place that smelled of souring milk. He didn't know how long he sat there, a wreck of a man on a sea of his own small, pathetic failure. The sound of the spaghetti sauce simmering on the stove was a mocking counterpoint to the roaring in his ears. Then he felt a touch. It was a tiny pressure on his shoulder, hesitant and light. He looked up through his fingers and saw Lily standing over him. Her colouring book was clutched in one hand, a green crayon in the other. Her face, a miniature, perfect echo of his own, was etched with a concern so profound it stole his breath. She wasn't crying, she wasn't scared. She was just worried. For him. In her wide, clear eyes he saw his own despair reflected back, and the sight of it was a bucket of ice water to the soul. He was her whole world now, her foundation, and he was crumbling. That small hand on his shoulder was an anchor point in the storm. It was real. It was something to hold on to. The self-pity, the rage at Sarah, the crushing weight of his own inadequacy, it all receded, pushed back by the undeniable reality of the little girl who was depending on him to be a father. He had been sinking, letting the current of his grief pull him under. But you can't build anything from the bottom of an ocean. You have to fight your way to the surface first. A decision formed in the ruins of his kitchen, a quiet, ironclad vow made to his daughter and to himself. He would stop sinking, he would stop reacting, he would start building. Not for revenge against Sarah, not to prove her wrong, but for a reason far more fundamental. He would build a life for Lily, a structure so strong and so secure that no storm could ever shake it. The first step was a sacrifice. The next Saturday, he washed and polished his most treasured possession, a deep blue 1972 Ford F100. It had been his father's truck, a rusted-out wreck that they had spent years restoring together in the garage. Every bolt, every piece of chrome, every layer of paint was a memory. The smell of the worn leather bench seat was the smell of his childhood. It was the only piece of his father he had left. He drove it to a classic car dealership, the engine rumbling a low, mournful protest. He sold it for less than it was worth, but more money than he had ever seen in one place. He walked away without looking back, the jingle of the keys in the dealer's hand sounding like a final goodbye. The pain of it was sharp and clean, an amputation of his past. He used the money to pay off the credit card debt Sarah had racked up in her final months and to hire a lawyer to begin untangling their finances. He put the rest into a savings account, a foundation stone for their future. With the chaos slightly more managed, his focus at work sharpened. He stopped being a man lost in a fog and started being the carpenter he was trained to be. Meticulous, efficient, and forward-thinking. He anticipated problems, he solved them without being asked, and he worked with a relentless, quiet intensity that began to get noticed. The new project his company had landed was a large, modern commercial building, a complex design of glass and steel. It was the kind of job that made or broke careers. The lead architect on the project was a woman named Elena Vance. She was sharp, dressed in practical but stylish clothes that seemed out of place on a muddy construction site, and she carried an air of no-nonsense authority that intimidated most of the crew. She saw the site not as a collection of men and machines, but as a living blueprint, and she had zero tolerance for deviations. Their first significant interaction was adversarial. There was a discrepancy in the plans for a complex support beam structure. The blueprints were ambiguous, and Liam, now a junior foreman, made a judgment call based on his experience. It was a solid, practical solution. Elena arrived on site the next day, took one look at the framing, and her face tightened. She found Liam, her tablet in hand, and pointed to his work. "Who authorized this change?" Her voice was calm, but edged with steel. "The plans were unclear," he explained, his own voice level. "This is the most structurally sound way to execute the load transfer." She swiped through the digital blueprint, her expression unreadable. "Your job is not to interpret, Mr. Miller. It is to build what is drawn. Your structurally sound solution creates a conflict with the HVAC ducting on the next floor." He felt a flush of anger and embarrassment. She was right. He had only been looking at his piece of the puzzle. She stood there, waiting for an argument, a defense. Instead, he just nodded. "I'll fix it. It'll be corrected by end of day." Her eyebrow arched slightly, surprised by his lack of ego. He and his team tore out the work and rebuilt it to her specifications. It cost them hours of grueling labor. But by the end of the day, it was perfect. The next morning, she found him on site. She didn't apologize, but she held out a revised print. "You were right," she said, her tone strictly professional. "Your way was better. I've redrawn the HVAC routing. Revert the structure to your original build." It wasn't praise, but it was something more valuable. Respect. It was the first solid brick laid in a new kind of foundation. 5 years passed. They did not fly by. They were ground out, one long, grueling day at a time. Time was measured in completed projects in Lily's school years, in the deepening lines around his eyes. The period became a montage of relentless forward motion, a long-form narrative of grit. Mornings started before dawn, with the quiet ritual of making coffee in the dark, the aroma a signal to his tired body that the day's labor had begun. He would pack Lily's lunch, always with a small note tucked inside, a habit he'd started that first terrible year. Then came the controlled chaos of the construction site, the roar of machinery, the shouts of men, the metallic tang of welding in the air. He moved through it all with a newfound purpose. He wasn't just building structures anymore, he was building a career. He became a sponge. He absorbed everything. He learned not just how to frame a wall, but why it was designed that way. He learned to read not just the lines on a blueprint, but the intent behind them. He spent his evenings after Lily was asleep, not in front of a television, but with textbooks. He studied for his contractor's license, for certifications in project management. His mind, once focused on the tangible world of wood and nails, now grappling with the abstract concepts of logistics, resource allocation, and critical path analysis. Marcus Thorne, his gruff boss, saw the transformation. He started giving Liam more responsibility, moving him from junior foreman to site supervisor. The hammer was replaced by a clipboard, the tool belt by a radio. He was no longer just a pair of hands. He was a mind, orchestrating the complex ballet of a multi-million-dollar construction project. His paychecks grew, and with them, a sense of security that was more valuable than the money itself. He moved them out of the old house, the one haunted by Sarah's ghost, and into a modest but clean apartment in a better school district. It was a space with no memories but the ones he and Lily would make together. His personal transformation was just as profound. The raw, desperate grief had hardened into something else entirely, a quiet, unshakable resolve. The naivete was gone, burned away in the fire of his betrayal. In its place was a cautious, observant patience. He became a man who listened more than he spoke, whose words, when they came, carried weight. The physical changes were subtle but significant. The grime under his fingernails was gone, replaced by clean, capable hands that now signed contracts and approved change orders. He traded his worn work shirts for collared Oxfords and his steel-toed boots for polished leather ones, not out of vanity, but because he was now walking through boardrooms instead of mud. The boyish look in his face had been replaced by the steady gaze of a man who understood the physics of stress and load, both in buildings and in life. There were threads of grey at his temples, silver evidence of the years of pressure. His relationship with Elena evolved on a parallel track. Their initial adversarial respect had blossomed into a formidable professional partnership. He became her go-to supervisor, the one person she trusted to translate her complex architectural visions into physical reality. She knew he understood the soul of her designs, and he knew she respected the practical limitations of concrete and steel. Their late nights were spent hunched over drafting tables, bathed in the cool glow of monitors, the air thick with the smell of coffee and paper. They argued, they debated, they collaborated. And somewhere in the midst of discussions about shear walls and tensile strength, a different kind of structure was being built between them. It was a slow, cautious process. He saw the passion she had for her work, the fierce intelligence in her eyes when she solved a design problem. She saw the unwavering integrity in him, the quiet strength of a man who met every obligation and never made an excuse. The shift from colleagues to something more was almost imperceptible. It started with a shared meal after a grueling 16-hour workday, both of them too tired to go home and cook. They talked about something other than work for the first time. He told her about Lily, about his pride in her latest report card. She told him about her family in another state, about the pressure she felt to succeed. There was a moment of shared vulnerability, a crack in the professional facade that let a little light in. One evening, he brought Lily to the office to pick up some paperwork. Elena was still there, and she spoke to Lily not as a child to be tolerated, but as a person, asking her about school, about her drawings. Lily, usually shy around strangers, opened up to her instantly. Watching them together, a warmth spread through Liam's chest, a feeling he had thought long dead. It wasn't the fiery, consuming passion he had felt for Sarah. This was different. It was a slow-burning ember, steady and warm and deeply comforting. It was a foundation of mutual respect, shared struggle, and genuine admiration. He didn't need to be fixed, and she wasn't looking for a project. They were two architects of their own lives, finding that their blueprints might just be compatible. Lily, meanwhile, was thriving. She was 10 years old now, a bright, funny, and resilient girl. The shadow of her mother's departure had faded, replaced by the unwavering certainty of her father's presence. He was at every school play, every parent-teacher conference. He taught her how to ride a bike, how to use a hammer, how to check the oil in a car. He was building her into a person who was as strong and self-sufficient as he was. Their bond was the central pillar of his existence, the structure around which everything else was built. He had done what he had vowed to do that night on the kitchen floor. He had built a safe and stable world for her, and in doing so, he had rebuilt himself. His work with Thorn Construction had culminated in him becoming a junior partner. Marcus, nearing retirement, saw Liam not just as an employee, but as a successor. Liam Miller, the carpenter, was now Liam Miller, the executive, a man who built skylines. His empire was small, but it was solid, and it was his. The past arrives when you least expect it, often on a day that feels perfectly ordinary. For Liam, it was a crisp autumn afternoon. The city skyline outside his office window was a jagged silhouette against a brilliant blue sky, a skyline he had personally helped to shape. He was reviewing a set of final plans for the new Thorn Miller headquarters, a sleek 40-story tower of glass and steel that was to be their company's crowning achievement. His intercom buzzed. His assistant, a crisp and efficient young woman named Clara, sounded flustered. "Mr. Miller, there's a woman here to see you. A Sarah Miller. She doesn't have an appointment." The name hit him like a physical blow, a shockwave from a distant explosion. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He had not heard that name, had not allowed himself to even think it, for almost 7 years. He looked at the picture on his desk, a smiling Lily, aged 10, holding a soccer trophy. He looked at the blueprint spread across his mahogany desk. He looked at the city he now helped command. Then he pressed the button. "Send her in, Clara." She walked in, and the contrast between the woman he remembered and the woman standing before him was jarring. The Sarah he knew had been vibrant, polished, radiating a confidence that bordered on arrogance. This Sarah was a ghost. The designer clothes were still there, but they were a season or two out of date, the fabric showing the subtle signs of wear. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was a little too brassy. The confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, nervous energy. She was thinner, and there were fine lines of stress around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. She was a building that had been stripped of its expensive facade, revealing the cheap construction underneath. Her new life, the one she had traded her family for, had clearly failed. The news of Julian Vance's financial collapse had been a minor story in the business pages a year ago. Indictments for fraud, assets frozen, a Ponzi scheme that had imploded. Liam had read it with a detached, clinical interest, the way one might read about a storm in a faraway country. He never imagined the wreckage would wash up on his shore. She stood awkwardly in the center of his spacious office, her eyes darting around, taking in the expensive furniture, the panoramic view, the sheer scale of his success. It was all a testament to the life he had built without her. Her gaze was a mixture of awe, envy, and something that looked dangerously like calculation. "Liam," she said, her voice a little shaky, "you look good." It was a weak opening, an attempt to bridge a 7-year chasm with a single, hollow compliment. He did not get up. He did not offer her a seat. He simply watched her, his face a calm, unreadable mask. His silence was a weapon, a vast, empty space she was forced to fill. She launched into her performance. It was a well-rehearsed monologue of remorse and victimhood. "I know I have no right to be here," she began, her voice catching with practiced emotion. "But I had to see you. I've made a terrible mistake, Liam. The worst mistake of my life." She painted a picture of herself as a naive woman, swept away by a charismatic monster. Julian had manipulated her, controlled her, isolated her from everyone. She had thought about him, about Lily, every single day. The words were perfectly chosen, the sentiment designed to elicit pity, to find a crack in the armor of the man he had become. But there were no cracks. He had spent years reinforcing his defenses. He He listened to her story of woe, her tale of being left with nothing when Julian's empire crumbled, and he felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, and certainly no pity. He was simply an engineer observing a flawed structure, noting its weaknesses and predicting its inevitable collapse. When she was finished, a hopeful, desperate look in her eyes, he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, level, and utterly devoid of emotion. "What do you want, Sarah?" The question cut through her act, stripping it down to its transactional core. This wasn't about absolution, it was about acquisition. The mask of the penitent victim fell away, replaced by a harder, more familiar expression. Pity had failed. It was time for leverage. "We're still married, Liam," she said, her voice gaining a sharp, metallic edge. "I looked it up. You never filed. In the eyes of the law, half of this," she gestured around the office, at the city beyond the glass. "Half of everything you've built is mine." She tried to use their daughter as a secondary attack. "And Lily? She deserves to know her mother. I want to be in her life. I have a right." The threat was clear. "Give me what I want, or I will burn this new life of yours to the ground. I will drag you through a messy, public divorce. I will poison your daughter against you." He felt a flicker of the old, cold fury, but he immediately quenched it. Emotion was a liability. This was a negotiation, and he had come prepared. Before she could continue her list of demands, the door to his office opened. It was Julian Vance. He looked worse than Sarah, his expensive suit hanging on a diminished frame, his face pale and drawn. The arrogance was still there, but it was the desperate, blustering arrogance of a man with nothing left to lose. He had clearly been waiting in the lobby, the muscle for Sarah's play. "My client has made a very reasonable opening position," Julian said, attempting a tone of authority that his circumstances completely undermined. "We're prepared to settle this quietly for a significant percentage of the company's assets." Liam looked from Sarah's greedy face to Julian's desperate one. He had expected this. He had planned for it. The showdown took place in the sterile quiet of Liam's office, a room that felt more like a command center than a personal space. High above the city, the noise of the streets was a distant murmur, leaving the tension in the room to fill the silence. Sarah and Julian stood before his desk like supplicants, though their demeanor was one of arrogant demand. Elena had entered the office just behind Julian, a silent, steady presence at Liam's side. She didn't speak, but her being there was a statement in itself. She was part of the foundation of this new life, and she would not be moved. Julian, taking the lead, laid out their terms with the faux confidence of a bluffer holding a losing hand. He spoke of community property, of Sarah's emotional distress, of her legal rights as a spouse and mother. He used words like equitable and amicable, but the meaning was clear: extortion. Liam listened to the entire speech without interruption. He let the silence hang in the air after Julian finished, a heavy blanket that smothered their blustering threats. He leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of calm control. He was no longer the broken man on the kitchen floor. He was a builder, a strategist, a man who understood that the most important work happens long before you ever break ground. When he was certain they had said all they had to say, he slowly reached into a drawer of his desk. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope and slid it across the polished mahogany. It made a soft, final sound as it came to rest in front of Julian. "I believe you'll find everything you need in there," Liam said, his voice flat and cold as steel. Julian picked it up, a smirk playing on his lips. assuming it was the opening salvo in a negotiation, a lowball settlement offer he could tear apart. He unclasped the flap and pulled out the contents. The smirk vanished. His face, already pale, turned a sickly shade of grey. He shuffled through the papers, his hands beginning to tremble. Sarah, sensing the shift in the room's power dynamic, leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the documents. Her breath hitched. The secret weapon was not one thing, but a meticulously assembled arsenal of facts, each one a perfectly aimed shot. The first document was a full forensic accounting of their joint finances from 7 years ago, prepared by a firm that specialized in high-conflict divorces. It detailed, with bank statements and credit card receipts, how Sarah had systematically drained over $50,000 from their accounts in the 6 months leading up to her departure. It was a clear, undeniable pattern of financial abandonment and fraud. The second set of documents was far more damaging for Julian. During the grind, as his own company became more successful, Liam had become cautious. He learned that information was a form of protection. On a hunch, 2 years ago, he had hired a discreet private investigator to look into Julian Vance, not out of lingering bitterness, but as a form of insurance. The investigator had uncovered details of Vance's shell corporations and offshore accounts that went far beyond what the federal prosecutors had found. It was a clear roadmap of embezzlement and tax evasion, evidence that would not just add years to Julian's sentence, but would also interest the very dangerous men he had swindled. The third document was a set of finalized divorce papers. Liam's lawyer had drafted them the day after Sarah had first reappeared. They were filed on the grounds of desertion, citing the 7 years of absence, and attached the forensic accounting as evidence of malicious intent, waiving any and all claims Sarah might have to his current or future assets. All it needed was a judge's signature, which would be a formality. The final paper, resting on top, was a draft for a restraining order against both Sarah and Julian, citing their current actions as attempted extortion and harassment. It included a sworn affidavit from his assistant, Clara, detailing Sarah's unscheduled arrival and Julian's threatening demeanor. Julian sank into one of the visitors' chairs, the papers slipping from his numb fingers. Sarah stared at the documents scattered on the desk, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. The entire foundation of their attack, their perceived leverage, had been vaporized. They had come to dismantle his life only to find he had built an impregnable fortress. They had mistaken his silence for weakness, his patience for passivity. They did not understand the mind of a builder. He always checked the foundation. He always planned for the worst-case scenario. "The divorce will be finalized next week," Liam stated, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "My lawyer will be in touch with yours, Julian, regarding the information in that second file. He advises that your full cooperation with the authorities might be beneficial." He then turned his gaze to Sarah, the first time he had truly looked at her since she walked in. There was no hatred in his eyes. There was nothing. She was a stranger, a ghost from a life that no longer existed. "You will not contact me, and you will not contact my daughter ever again. If you do, I will enforce the restraining order, and I will use every resource I have to ensure you understand the consequences. Are we clear?" Sarah could only nod, tears of rage and defeat welling in her eyes. It was over. Her last gamble had failed spectacularly. They had come to collect on a debt they felt they were owed, and instead they had been handed a bill for their own destruction. They left without another word. Julian Vance, the charismatic tycoon, scurried out of the office like a beaten dog. Sarah followed, her shoulders slumped, a woman utterly vanquished. Liam didn't watch them go. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, he turned his back on that part of his life for the last time. He felt no surge of triumph, no thrill of victory. The primary emotion that washed over him was not elation, but lightness, a profound, bone-deep sense of peace, a weight he hadn't even fully realized he was still carrying. The last ghost of his past had been exorcised. The final piece of demolition was complete, and the sight was finally completely clear. He felt the light pressure of a hand on his arm and looked over at Elena. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes were filled with a deep, quiet pride and understanding. She had seen the full measure of the man she had come to love, not his anger, but his strength, not his vengeance, but his foresight. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. The contact was grounding, a confirmation of the solid, real world he now inhabited. That evening he didn't go back to the blueprints. He picked Lily up from her soccer practice and on an impulse took her and Eleanor downtown. Not to a restaurant or a movie, but to the Thorne Miller Tower, his signature achievement, which was nearing its final completion. Using his master key, he took them up the construction elevator, the unfinished floors flying by until they reached the rooftop. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The entire city was spread out below them, a glittering tapestry of light and life. The wind was cool and clean at this height, whipping at their hair, carrying away the last vestiges of the day's confrontation. Lily, fearless and full of life, ran to the edge of the safety barrier, her arms spread wide as if she could embrace the whole world. "You can see everything from here, Dad," she yelled over the wind, her voice full of pure, uncomplicated joy. He stood with Eleanor, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his. They watched Lily, a small, vibrant figure against the vast urban landscape. He looked at the buildings, the bridges, the highways, a world of concrete and steel, of angles and stress points, a world he understood. For years he had thought that this, the act of building these massive, permanent structures, was his purpose. He had poured his pain, his discipline, and his ambition into the foundations of these towers, seeking to create something so strong it could never be broken. But standing here now, with the cool weight of Elena's head on his shoulder and the sound of his daughter's laughter on the wind, he understood the truth. The skyscrapers were just steel and glass, the contracts were just paper. His real empire, the one that truly mattered, was not the one spread out before him. It was the small, powerful unit standing right here with him on this rooftop. It was the family he had built from the wreckage, a structure founded not on concrete, but on loyalty, resilience, and a quiet, unshakable love. It was stronger than any tower he could ever design. Elena turned her face up to him, her eyes reflecting the twilight sky. "What a view," she said softly. "What's next?" He looked away from the skyline and met her gaze. He saw their entire future reflected there, more challenges, more projects, more late nights over blueprints, but also more soccer games, more quiet mornings, more of this simple, profound peace. He pulled her closer, his gaze shifting to his daughter, his bright, beautiful Lily, who was now pointing out landmarks she recognized. He had his answer. The work was never truly done. There was always something new to build. He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He felt the solid, dependable weight of their hands in his. "Let's go home," he said.